So do you think the Israelites really took over Jericho like the Bible says? Well, watch this video and tell me what you think.
The ancient city of Jericho is one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world. It lies 22 kilometers east of Jerusalem and 10 kilometers west of the Jordan River.
Did you know we know where the real Jericho is?
Jericho has been excavated by a number of different archaeological teams. And we have evidence not just for one Jericho, but actually for multiple Jerichos, one city built on top of another. Now, that's where the debate and the problem comes in, because the simple question is, which of the many Jerichos that exist is the one that Joshua might have captured?
The Bible's own chronology says when Jericho fell, in 1406 BC. So if the story is true, there should be evidence of destruction from the 1400s, the late Bronze Age.
What you're going to find is there is lots of evidence for the destruction of Jericho, but not all archaeologists agree on the interpretation of the evidence.
In the 1930s, British archaeologist John Garstang finds a network of collapsed walls. They seem to have fallen in a dramatic fashion. Garstang analyzes the Canaanite pottery. It's from the period experts call the late Bronze Age.
Garstang, who said that, he had late bronze material and the destruction happened around 1400 BC, which happens to be the biblical dating of the account in the book of Joshua about the destruction of Jericho.
That means the walls were destroyed around 1400 BC. That's exactly the time frame of the Battle of Jericho in the Bible. Garstang's evidence supports the Bible's story. In the 1950s, a new excavation begins at Tel Sultan. The lead archaeologist is Kathleen Kenyon, a colleague of Garstang's. Everyone expects her to confirm his results. Instead, she flatly contradicts Garstang.
Kenyon, she came along in the 1950s, she said, well, no, Garstang's wrong. There was nobody living there at that time.
She dates the Canaanite pottery to the Middle Bronze Age, 1550 BC, 150 years earlier. Joshua wasn't even born then. It means Garstang was wrong. It means the Bible is wrong.
Or does it? Maybe Kathleen Kenyon's interpretation of the data and the history is wrong.
So if you go with Kenyon's dating, then that city that's destroyed at Jericho cannot have been destroyed by Joshua. Jericho is empty at that time. There is no city for Joshua to capture, meaning the story didn't happen.
In the early days, the majority view was that that was a historical battle, and that has changed over time into where today the majority view would be that it's legendary.
And Wood discovers that the damage to the Bible is even worse. There's no possibility that the Bible got its chronology wrong by 150 years. As a result, scholars are questioning the whole of Joshua's conquest.
The book of Joshua talks about a blitzkrieg war. The Israelites came in and they conquered Jericho, Jerusalem, Megiddo, and Hatzor, all of those. If the battle at Jericho did not take place the way that the Bible says it did, then why should we believe the account for the capture of any of the other cities? Kenyon's discoveries at Jericho have called the whole biblical account into question.
1983, Toronto University. Bryant Wood, at last, completes his PhD thesis. He's only too aware that most scholars no longer believe the Bible's story of the fall of Jericho. But Wood is now himself an expert in the Canaanite pottery of the late Bronze Age, the very period when the Bible says Jericho was conquered.
The subject of my thesis was late Bronze Age pottery. In the course of my studies, I was collecting the late Bronze Age pottery that had been excavated by various expeditions. And I came across the site of Jericho.
Wood decides to re-examine the pottery reports of Jericho. He wants to check if Garstang and Kenyon dated the pottery shards correctly. But the pottery proves difficult to locate.
So I realized that a lot of his pottery remained unpublished and that he had given it to various institutions that had supported his excavation.
Unlike other archaeologists, Wood decides to track down every pottery shard.
When I went to the Louvre, they pulled out boxes, I swear, that had not been looked in since Garstang sent it there.
Wood meticulously documents each piece.
Archaeology is not only work out in the field excavating a site, sometimes you have to excavate a museum basement.
After months of checking, Wood makes a startling discovery. Kenyon had been selective in her examination of pottery.
She never analyzed her local Canaanite pottery that she found in that destruction debris. She was basing it solely on the absence of imported pottery.
That makes Wood doubt the reliability of Kenyon's dating of Jericho. He then checks Garstang's pottery. To his amazement, his original assessment was spot on.
When I looked at the Jericho material, I saw pottery that was very definitely late Bronze Age. And when I looked at it, I could see, wow, this is late Bronze 1.
Pottery doesn't lie. In Wood's expert opinion, the shards of Canaanite pottery are clear. They put the destruction of Jericho at precisely 1400 BC, the time of Joshua.
Kenyon said there was no city or town or habitation during this time period. It's the 15th century BC. She said it was abandoned. Well, this is strange. Here's pottery that's clearly 15th century in date.
It all means that the fall of Jericho did happen at the time of Joshua, just as the Bible claims. But did it happen exactly as the Bible says it did? What about Joshua's miraculous crossing into the Promised Land? The story of Rahab and the spies, the trumpets, and the tumbling walls of Jericho. Wood knows archaeology can't prove Joshua sends spies into Jericho, but the strategy seems correct on military grounds.
Joshua is not only a great military strategist and tactician, he's probably one of the greatest generals of antiquity. His first tactical requirement is, of course, to gather as much information as he can about the enemy. If the account of Joshua is a fraud, then it was written by someone who really understood the nature of combat.
Biblical archaeologists would regard the truth of the Rahab episode as futile speculation. But Wood finds that experts on military strategy have no such qualms. Wood is satisfied that the date and start of the Joshua story is historically possible. The real challenge for Wood is Joshua's attack on Jericho itself. Can his expertise in archaeology prove the details of the story? The Bible says the siege took place in the spring, just after the harvest.
Now, when the spies went in to Jericho and they went to Rahab's house, she hid them under the flax on her roof. Well, the flax was up there because it was drying. And that's another indicator that it was just after the harvest.
That's an unusually precise detail for a story set 3,500 years ago. Wood wants to see whether archaeology can confirm the season and duration of the siege. He sifts through the excavation reports of Garstang and Kenyon. He's looking for any clues they may have overlooked. He's intrigued by one of their discoveries. They found rooms with large storage jars. The jars were full of grain, untouched for thousands of years. Garstang and Kenyon had paid little attention to the grain. But to Wood, it's evidence that the siege occurred soon after the spring harvest, just as the story says.
It's obvious that this grain had just been harvested because the jars were full. They had not used this grain yet. And that again agrees with the Bible.
Wood could not only confirm the season, but also the duration of the siege. In theory, Jericho could have held out for months, years even.
And we know at Jericho that there is a spring that runs all year round, and if they still had access to that spring, they had then plentiful water. We're also told in the biblical account that the harvest had just taken place. So there should have been a lot of food there.
But the Bible is quite specific about the length of the siege. It says it only lasted 7 days. That's another very precise detail. And it's also confirmed by the jars of grain.
It was not consumed. The jars were full. And so the siege of the city was very short. The Bible tells us exactly how long. It was 7 days. So the jars of grain correlate very nicely with what we read in the Bible.
The pottery confirms the dating of the Bible story. And the grain backs the timing of the attack. Joshua leads his army towards Jericho. The city closes its gates, and its population is sealed in. Confronting Joshua are the walls of Jericho, tall and impregnable, or so they seemed. The tumbling walls of Jericho is the most famous moment in the story. Wood decides it's time to see the evidence for himself. September 1997. It's a 2-hour drive from Tel Aviv Airport to Jericho. For Wood, it's an opportunity of a lifetime to examine firsthand the results of previous excavations. Everywhere around him, he sees evidence of fallen walls. No one's ever denied that the walls of Jericho collapsed in ancient times.
We have to remember that this is not the only time that the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. They seem to have done it with some frequency.
The real question is whether they collapsed at the time of Joshua's attack. The Bible says yes, it was a miracle. Wood wonders if there might also be a natural explanation. Jericho is very close to the River Jordan fault line. Closer than San Francisco is to the San Andreas fault. An earthquake is a very distinct possibility.
Both Garstang and Kenyon found evidence of earthquake activity. And so it could have been another earthquake that brought the walls down.
But military experts don't believe that an earthquake makes any sense.
Would be a dumb commander that would somehow think that it will delay the invasion or the attack on Jericho until the next earthquake. It's silly to attribute something to an event which is more easily explained by other, more simple and provable causes. The destruction of the walls of Jericho has nothing to do with an earthquake. It's easily explainable in military terms.
For Gabriel, the success of Joshua's attack can be explained entirely by his military genius. Dr. Bryant Wood doesn't doubt that Joshua was a military genius. But he can't accept the tumbling walls of Jericho is just a figure of speech. Rather than speculate about military tactics, he wonders if archaeology has the evidence. He goes back to the Bible. He's looking for evidence that the story is an eyewitness account. He comes across another unusual detail. The Bible says the house of Rahab the prostitute was spared in the attack. Wood wonders if any archaeologists have ever found evidence of a wall that did not collapse. In 1907, a German team dug on the north side of the city wall. What they found has been gathering dust for more than a century. But for Wood, it proves to be pay dirt. The German team found that a mud brick wall was still standing 3,500 years later. It's just the kind of detail that makes Wood think the Bible is an eyewitness account. Was it Rahab's wall? At the bottom of the wall, they found remains of a domestic dwelling.
On the earthen embankment, there were many buildings, one of which could have been Rahab's house, because there were some buildings built right against the lower city wall.
So far, Wood finds an explanation for almost every detail in the Bible's story. From the planning and timing of the invasion, to the tumbling walls themselves. But can Wood account for the story's blood-curdling climax?
The Bible tells us that after the Israelites entered the city, that they set it on fire. And that's as much as we're told. It was a massive destruction.
The Bible says the Israelites don't actually plunder the grain for their own use. They leave it behind. For Wood, the Bible account is plausible if the archaeology proves the sequence exactly as the Bible has it. No one disputes that the walls of Jericho collapsed. The question is whether it was followed by a massive fire. He combs Kathleen Kenyon's archaeological reports for clues of a cataclysmic fire. Wood knows that Kenyon gave the fall of Jericho an earlier date. But in a documentary, she did at least acknowledge that the city had indeed suffered a violent inferno.
There is no doubt, though, about the disaster which finally overtook them. This red and white streak is the remains of tremendous fire. It was so fierce that the 10-foot thick walls were burnt through and through.
What has been found here in the southeast sector there, very violent fire, about a meter thick of burned debris and ash and so on. Quite clear that it was a very massive destruction and evidently throughout the whole town.
So there was a fire. But did it come before or after the walls collapsed? Wood examines Kenyon's reports, and he finds evidence that first the walls collapsed and then the city met its fiery end.
That's exactly the sequence we have in the Bible. The walls fell down, the Israelites charged up into the city, and then they set it on fire. And she reports that is what she observed from the archaeology. Earthquake, then fire.
For Wood, there's only one piece of the jigsaw to fit in. Joshua's decision not to plunder the grain. How on earth can Wood prove this extraordinarily precise piece of detail? Suddenly, Wood remembers the storage jars. They were evidence of the season and duration of the siege. But clearly, they're also evidence that Jericho was not plundered, just as the Bible claims.
The fact that it was left there to be burned in the destruction is very unusual and very rare, and we just don't find that in other sites that have been excavated. So when you look at all of this evidence, you compare it to the narrative, we see very detailed correlation there. And to my mind, it certainly shows not only accuracy, but even eyewitness account recorded at the time that it happened.
Israel, 1995. Bryant Wood is on his next dig and enjoying the fruits of his decision 30 years earlier to take up archaeology. Aided by geology and military strategy, he has overturned 40 years of skepticism towards the story of the fall of Jericho. What a difference a shard of pottery and a grain of wheat can make.
As far as I know, there's no archaeological find that contradicts what the Bible says. The only problem is how people interpret the archaeological finds.
To this date, less than 50% of Tel Sultan has been excavated. Future digs could well unearth the definitive truth behind the destruction of the ancient city of Jericho.